In the world of Old West history, Billy the Kid has one face everyone knows, because for over a century, there's only been one photo most historians trust. But now, a new image from near Silver City is being pushed as a second, lost portrait of the most famous outlaw of them all. Sounds huge, right? Here's the problem. The way this photo was verified has a major flaw that most people never hear about. So let's slow down, look at what the evidence actually says, and separate a great story from something you can prove. Number 1. 2 photos, 1 reputation. Put 2 images in your head at the same time. The first is that small, beat-up tintype everyone associates with Billy the Kid. A young guy standing with a rifle, hat low, bandana at the neck, looking like he's half squinting at the camera and half daring it to blink first. The second is the so-called Silver City image. The one people say shows a younger Billy at a mining site near Silver City, New Mexico, years before he became the headline outlaw. One of these pictures is the only photograph most historians will treat as authenticated. The other is the kind of photo that makes people lean forward and whisper, "What if?" Because if the Silver City picture really is Billy, it's not just a fun trivia upgrade. It would mess with the way we've pictured him for more than a century. Portraits, museum displays, movie casting choices, the whole visual Billy the Kid in pop culture. Suddenly you'd have to ask if the face we've been copying and pasting is the wrong one. That's the part that hooks people. The idea that history didn't change, but our mental picture of it did. And there's another reason this gets sticky. Billy the Kid is one of those Old West names where myth and paperwork are always fighting for control. Outlaw stories spread fast, lawman stories spread faster, and once a legend gets a face, it becomes hard to take that face away. So when someone claims a new Billy photo, it isn't just a photo question. It becomes an identity fight, and identity fights get emotional. The problem is, with Old West photography, emotion is the easiest thing in the world to manufacture. Most 1870s frontier photos are anonymous unless somebody wrote names down in the moment, and the photo stayed in the same family long enough for that note to mean something. If you don't have that boring paper trail, you're left with vibes. He looks right. The era fits. The clothes fit. The story sounds believable. And vibes are not evidence. So the only fair way to handle the Silver City claim is the same way you'd handle any big historical claim. Build the strongest case for it, then stress test it against what can actually be verified. Not what people want to be true, not what makes a great documentary beat, but what survives contact with real sourcing. Number 2. Before the legend, there was a kid in a mining town. Start with the part that's easy to forget. Billy the Kid didn't hatch out of a wanted poster. He started as a teenage boy bouncing around the American frontier, which in the 1870s was basically a pressure cooker of poverty, migration, and unstable law enforcement. His birth name is usually given as Henry McCarty, and he later used names like William H. Bonney and Henry Antrim. Even basic details, like the exact day he was born, get argued about, which tells you right away the record isn't perfect. What does matter for the Silver City claim is this. He spent formative years in New Mexico territory, and Silver City was part of that story. Silver City wasn't a quiet ranch town. It was a mining place. Money coming in, people coming through, jobs that were rough, and a lot of kids growing up too fast. That kind of environment produces the exact kind of faces you see in frontier photos. Lean teenagers in worn clothes, trying to look older than they are, because being seen as just a kid could get you pushed around. By the time he's in the historical spotlight, Billy is wrapped up in the Lincoln County War era and the violence around it. But before that, his life is a chain of small turns. His mother's illness, the family moving, financial struggle, and then the moment he starts sliding into trouble. One early arrest story that gets repeated a lot is that he was caught stealing food and ended up in jail, then escaped. Whether you know every detail or not, the general shape is consistent. A teenager on the margins, surviving by hustle, and learning early that the law wasn't a stable safety net. It was a moving target. This is why Silver City matters as a setting. If somebody shows you a mid-1870s mining town photo and says, "That could be young Billy," your brain goes, "Yeah, that checks out." It's not a crazy setting for him. It's plausible. And in these debates, plausible is the doorway people walk through before they start treating a claim as proven. But here's the trap. Plausible is not the same as specific. A teenager in New Mexico territory in the 1870s describes thousands of people. If your evidence only gets you to could be, you're still miles away from is. Number 3, the one tintype that wouldn't go away. That famous Billy image isn't famous because it's crystal clear. It's famous because it has a traceable story attached to it. The photo is usually described as a ferrotype, also called a tintype. Basically a direct positive image on a thin sheet of iron, not paper. Back then, these were cheap, fast, and common. You could get one made in minutes, which is why tintypes exploded in popularity across the United States. The weird part about tintypes is they reverse the image like a mirror. That's how you got the old "Billy was left-handed" debate. People looked at his gun placement and assumed left-handedness, until you remember you're looking at a reversed image, and a lot of people carried weapons however they felt like anyway. Once you get comfortable with that reversal, you start noticing how many obvious details in old photos can mislead you. The other key detail is how these photos were produced in batches. Some photographers used multi-lens cameras that could expose multiple identical images at once on a single plate. Then they'd cut the plate into separate small tintypes to sell. In the Billy tintype story, the surviving image is often described as the only remaining piece from a set that got separated over time, with other plates lost, destroyed, or only known through copies and references. When historians talk about this tintype, they don't just say, "It looks like him." They talk about chain of custody. Who had it, how it moved, when copies appeared, where early printed versions showed up, and how the image became linked to the name William H. Bonney in the historical record. You can argue over exact details, like where exactly it was taken and which photographer made it. But there's still a continuity that doesn't exist for most new discovery photos. And the money side matters too. When the known Billy tintype sold at auction for millions, it didn't just confirm its status as an artifact. It lit a flare over the whole Old West collectible world. Once the public hears the only authenticated Billy the Kid photo is worth over $2 million, people start digging through trunks, antique stores, flea markets, and family albums with dollar signs in their eyes. That doesn't mean every new photo is fake, but it absolutely changes the ecosystem you're operating in. Number 4, the gold rush for new Billy photos. After that record-setting sale, the Old West photo market didn't just get hotter, it got noisy. Not every collector is shady. Plenty of people honestly believe they've found something real. But the incentive structure gets warped fast when a single small photo becomes a multi-million-dollar object. You saw this with the famous croquet photo claim. A collector bought a tintype for basically nothing, and suddenly there were headlines saying it might show Billy the Kid hanging out and playing croquet with friends in the late 1870s. It's a perfect media story. A $2 purchase, a legendary outlaw, an everyday scene that humanizes him, and a huge potential valuation if authenticated. The public loves it because it feels like time travel. But the croquet photo also shows the pattern. Big claim, big buzz, lots of confident language in promotional materials, and then years of debate because the documentation isn't strong enough to shut the argument down. Even when experts weigh in, you often get a split between people who say, "Interesting but not proven," and people who say, "Close enough, let's roll with it." That's the background you need for the Silver City image. It didn't appear in a vacuum. It appeared in a world already primed to believe there's more Billy material out there, and already trained by headlines to treat maybe as basically yes. And once a claim gets filmed, once it becomes a documentary arc, everything about it starts to feel more official. A narrator you recognize, dramatic music, a detective with a badge, a few technical terms like facial recognition or forensic analysis. You don't even have to lie. You just have to present uncertainty with confidence, and most viewers will experience that as proof. Number 5. The Silver City image and the story built around it. Here's what gets claimed about the Silver City image in plain language. It's an old photograph from the Right General era, showing a young man who looks like he could be Billy at a younger age. The setting is described as connected to mining near Silver City, which fits the general, Billy was around mining towns as a teen. Storyline people already know. The clothes look period appropriate. The vibe fits the Old West. Nothing about the image screams modern fake. Then the story gets a boost, because it isn't just a random internet post. It's been pushed through a documentary pipeline. There's a production titled Billy the Kid, the Silver City Photo, and the framing is basically, an NYPD facial recognition detective investigates whether this is a never-before-seen photo of Billy. Once you attach NYPD and facial recognition to a claim, a lot of people immediately stop thinking of it as history and start thinking of it as science. In the narrative built around the image, you also see an effort to lock down who else is in the photo and how it supposedly traveled. The photo is often described as having surfaced in Canada, and the argument tries to connect that to the supposed identity of a woman in the image, someone with ties that could make a Canada connection feel less random. The logic is basically, if we can identify other people in the photo, we can anchor the whole thing. That's a reasonable instinct. Real provenance work often happens exactly like that. You identify one person, then you build outward. The catch is, you don't get to identify people by assumption. You identify them by records, handwriting, family archives, or multiple independent sources that converge. If the other person identification is weak, then the whole structure built on top of it is weak too. And that's the core tension with this image. The Silver City photo claim is not crazy because it's impossible. It's controversial because the evidence people use to prove it is not as solid as the presentation makes it feel. Number 6. Provenance. The unsexy thing that separates history from fan fiction. In the Old West, almost everything dramatic happened faster than the paperwork. That's why provenance is such a big deal now. Provenance is just the history of an object, where it came from, who owned it, how it moved, and whether those steps can be checked. A strong provenance story sounds boring. It looks like this. A photo was owned by a person connected to the subject, then passed through a family line, and along the way it shows up in a diary, a newspaper halftone, a catalogue, a legal record, a museum loan, or something else you can point to without squinting. The more boring receipts you have, the stronger the claim. A weak provenance story sounds exciting. It looks like this. It was found in an antique shop. Or, it came out of a box of Frontier photos. Or, someone's grandfather said it was Billy. Those stories might be true, but they're not verifiable in the way historians need. This is where the Silver City photo has a problem right out of the gate. The found in Canada detail is not provenance by itself. Canada is a country, not a chain of custody. If you can't trace the photo back through owners, or at least tie it to a specific person, Canada is basically just atmosphere. And when the provenance is vague, the photo becomes a blank screen for projection. People start filling the gaps with what they already believe. That Billy survived longer than the record says, that there are secret photos hidden in private collections, that the real story was covered up by lawmen, that historians are too cautious, that modern tech can solve it instantly. The photo becomes less like evidence and more like a Rorschach test. If you want a simple rule that works almost every time, the more a claim relies on a dramatic backstory instead of documented ownership, the more careful you need to be. Number 7. Dating a photo isn't the same thing as naming the person in it. One of the easiest traps in historical photo debates is confusing authentic old photo with authentic ID of the subject. Those are two totally different questions. Photo dating is a real skill. You can look at the photo process, tintype versus albumin print, the type of mount, the edges, the chemistry patterns, the way the exposure behaves, even how the image sits on the surface. You can also date clothing styles, hat shapes, and the general studio vibe. A lot of that can tell you whether something could plausibly be from the 1870s, but none of that tells you the name of the person in the picture. The Old West was full of young men who fit the frontier teen profile. Slim build, dark hair, similar hats, similar work clothes, similar expressions, and the same hard life stamped across the face. If you took 50 photos of ranch hands and miners in New Mexico Territory in the mid-1870s and laid them on a table, you'd be shocked by how many would look Billy-ish at a glance. That's why the famous Billy tintype matters. It isn't accepted because Billy looks like Billy. It's accepted because the identity is anchored by historical handling and documentation, plus the fact that it's been studied for so long that even the flaws in the tintype have their own history. So when someone says, the Silver City photo is period correct, the only honest response is, okay, cool. That means it's an old photo. It does not mean it's Billy. To get from old to Billy, you need something that ties the subject to the name. That could be a period inscription with supporting evidence, a photographer's ledger, an original envelope with a studio mark and a client name, or a family archive that can be checked independently. Without that, the identity claim rests heavily on appearance, and appearance is the most fragile foundation you can build on. Number 8, what facial recognition can do, and why it can also mislead you. Facial recognition sounds like a magic wand because it's marketed that way. In reality, it's a tool, and like any tool, it depends on inputs. If you feed it clean, front-facing, high-quality images with consistent lighting, it can be extremely effective in modern settings. But historical photographs are basically the opposite of the ideal environment. Old images have blur, chemical damage, fading, scratches, uneven exposure, and odd angles. Faces may be partially shadowed by hats. Expressions are stiff because exposures took time. And if you're working from scans floating around online, you've got another layer of distortion, compression, sharpening, contrast boosts, and sometimes plain old bad scanning. Forensic and scientific guidance on facial comparison is pretty blunt about this. Lower image quality weakens the strength of any conclusion you can responsibly draw. You can still compare, but you have to downgrade your confidence and be careful about overclaiming. There's also a human factor people forget. Even if software produces a match score, that number doesn't magically become historical truth. In real investigative work, results are supposed to be reviewed, limitations reported, and the conclusion framed properly, especially when images are imperfect and the stakes of misidentification are high. Now add one more problem that's specific to Billy the Kid. You don't have a large set of known reference images. You basically have one widely accepted photo. That's like trying to do voice recognition on someone you've only heard say one sentence once, through static, 140 years ago. Even if the match looks plausible, your baseline is tiny. The risk of false confidence jumps up, and there's a psychological trap that kicks in as soon as software enters the story. People hear forensic and assume it's automatically objective. But software can only compare what you give it, and if the comparison set includes wrong identities, the output becomes sophisticated nonsense. Not because the software is evil, because the input assumptions are broken. Number 9. The Billy's Mother. Photo that keeps breaking cases. This is the piece that makes a lot of historians throw their hands up, because it's a classic example of how errors spread in popular history. For decades, a certain photograph of a woman circulated labeled as Billy the Kid's mother, Catherine McCarty Antrim. It showed up in books and articles because it filled an emotional gap. People wanted a face for Billy's mother, and publishers love images that make a story feel complete. The problem is that identification doesn't rest on solid documentation. It rests on repetition, and repetition is not proof. The story that's been reported by multiple writers is that author Eugene Cunningham attached that identity to the woman's photo in the 1930s and later admitted he didn't actually know who she was. Meanwhile, the mislabeled image kept traveling through Old West media like a virus, because once something is printed in a serious-looking book, future authors assume it was verified by someone else. Now plug that into a facial recognition-based argument. If you use that misidentified mother photo as a comparison image, trying to show family resemblance between the woman and the young man in the Silver City image. You've created a chain with a rotten link. Even if the software finds similarity, you haven't proven a mother-son relationship. You've just proven similarity between two faces in two old photos, one of which may have no connection to Billy's real family at all. That's not a small technicality. That's a foundational issue. Because once a key comparison image is unreliable, it doesn't matter how fancy the analysis sounds. You're not doing historical verification anymore. You're doing pattern matching on an unstable premise. And that's exactly how a lot of new Billy photo claims gain momentum. They borrow confidence from tech language, while quietly depending on old mislabels that specialists have been warning about for years. Number 10. How a documentary can turn. Maybe into basically proven. Documentaries aren't automatically wrong. Some are fantastic. But a documentary is a story machine first. Even when it's honest, it still has to create forward motion. Question, clue, expert, reveal, twist, stakes. That structure can make shaky evidence feel sturdy, because it's presented in a sequence that feels like an investigation coming to a conclusion. With the Silver City photo, you can see how the scaffolding gets built. Step 1 is the hook. This might be Billy the Kid, and if it is, we've had the wrong face in our heads forever. Step 2 is authority. An NYPD detective who works with facial recognition is looking at it. Step 3 is emotional reinforcement. Familiar narration, dramatic framing, and the sense that you're watching something being solved. Then you get the quiet part. What images were used for comparison? What assumptions were made about other people in the photo? And how much of the provenance is actually documented versus inferred? Another layer that often rides along with these claims is the survival theory ecosystem. The idea that Billy didn't die in 1881 and lived on under another name, like Brushy Bill Roberts. Once a project is connected to that world, it tends to collect additional comparisons and supporting materials that are controversial on their own. That can create a kind of evidence pile where each piece is used to support the next piece, but none of the pieces are truly anchored. It's like stacking chairs on top of chairs and calling it a building. From a distance, it looks tall and impressive. Up close, it's unstable because the base isn't concrete. This is also why professional historians tend to sound boring in interviews. They don't get excited until the boring stuff is handled. Documentation, dates, names, physical examination, and independent verification. The moment someone says, "This changes everything," historians usually reply with some version of, "Show me the paperwork." Not because they hate surprises, because they've watched surprises turn into errors too many times. Number 11, the face match that feels convincing and the details that don't. When people argue about whether two photos show the same person, they usually start with the overall vibe. Same era, same type of face, similar hair, similar expression. That's how the Silver City image wins people over at first glance. The young man has that lean, youthful look you can imagine in New Mexico territory. If you already know Billy's story, your brain happily connects the dots. The real test is the slow comparison. Features that don't easily change with mood or clothing. Ears are a big one, because ear shape is pretty stable. Jawline and chin shape matter. The spacing of features matters. The shape of the nose bridge matters. And you also have to control for the tintype mirror effect. Because if you compare a reversed tintype to a non-reversed image without correcting for it, you can fool yourself fast. Here's the frustrating truth. You can make two people look more similar than they are by choosing flattering crops, matching angles, and ignoring the areas that don't line up. You can also make the same person look surprisingly different in two different photos. Modern face research even shows that photos of the same person can vary a lot, enough to cause mistakes when you're relying on a single image as a reference. So what do careful analysts do? They treat resemblance as a starting point, not a finish line. They ask, is there independent evidence that this person was in that place at that time? Is there any writing on the photo? Any connection to a known photographer? Any family archive link? Any documented ownership trail? Anything that doesn't depend on, he looks like him? In the Silver City debate, the pushback has been consistent. The provenance is not strong enough. The supporting identifications used to reinforce the claim are disputed, and the scientific confidence gets undermined if the comparison set includes misidentified images. Some researchers who focus on Old West photo authentication have publicly argued the Silver City photo is not Billy, or at minimum that the documentary's method doesn't prove it. That doesn't mean the photo is worthless. It can still be a real, fascinating frontier image, maybe even tied to Silver City or the broader mining world of that era. It just means the jump from interesting old photo to this is Billy the Kid is bigger than people admit. Number 12. What would actually change the scoreboard? If someone truly wants to move the Silver City photo claim from debated to accepted, the path isn't more dramatic narration or a higher match score. The path is boring, physical, and document heavy. First, you need the best possible version of the image. Direct examination, high-resolution scans made properly, and analysis of the physical object, not just a copy floating around online. You want to know what the photo is made of, whether it has a studio mark, what the edges show, whether there are any traces of mounting or an original case, and whether the image has been altered or retouched. Second, you need independent anchors. If the claim is hydraulic mine near Silver City, then you want a location that can be checked against period mining history. If the claim is, this woman is Margaret Keyes Miller, then you want multiple sources that tie that face to that name, not just a convenient story that matches the Canada detail. Third, you want contemporary documentation. The Holy Grail is something like a photographer's ledger listing names, a letter describing the photo session, an envelope with handwriting that can be dated and verified, or a family archive where the photo is consistently identified long before modern money or media hype entered the picture. And finally, you want the claim to survive independent scrutiny. Not just one team with one narrative, but multiple qualified people who don't have a stake in the outcome, looking at the same evidence and reaching compatible conclusions. Because that's the difference between a good story about the Old West and a piece of the Old West we can responsibly label and display. If any future evidence ever shows up, an inscription that can be authenticated, a matching group photo from the same day, a record that pins the faces to names, then the Silver City image stops being a guessing game and starts being a document. Until then, it lives in the space where the Old West always lives best, right between legend and paperwork, where one new fact can flip the whole conversation overnight.